You know, being a content creator who focuses on fantasy football, sometimes I just sit around on my computer and I scroll through current ADP and see what stands out. And I've got to say, there is a player that is definitely standing out. This is a guy who was once beloved by most of the fantasy community, but now not only has he fallen out of favor, it seems like he's been forgotten completely. This is the story of that forgotten hidden gem who I suggest you draft as much as you can this year. Hey, before we get into that, I've got to tell you some exciting news. Introducing Draft Lane, the ultimate app for every fantasy football enthusiast. Take a trip down memory lane with our unique league history feature, giving you a comprehensive view of all your past leagues. Challenge yourself by comparing your historical performance against your league mates. Climb up the ranks and strive for the top spot in the Draft Lane rankings. Connect directly with Pierre and myself to receive answers to all your burning fantasy questions. Experience the ultimate draft companion. We can tell you exactly who to pick when you're on the clock to help you draft that winning roster. During the season, rely on Draft Lane to help you set winning lineups, make strategic waiver pickups, and even get personalized trade advice, all through our user-friendly app. Download Draft Lane for free on the App Store or Google Play for Android phones today. And here's an exclusive offer. Be one of the first 10 people to sign up using promo code FANTASYEG1 and we will put $10 in your account. Don't wait. Join the fantasy football revolution with Draft Lane. Download now and start dominating your league. So to properly tell you the story of this forgotten hidden gem, we've got to go way back in time to the 2022 offseason. Yes, we're going to go back all the way to last year in the offseason because I think there are two players who are great examples for what this player could be this year. And I got to start with Josh Jacobs. If you remember last year, he had completely fallen out of favor with the fantasy community. He was being drafted as the running back 24, and it really made a lot of sense because the Raiders didn't pick up his fifth-year option. They drafted Zamir White, and then in the first preseason game, they had Josh Jacobs out there playing with the backups. All signs were pointing to Josh Jacobs being out of favor with this new coaching staff. But of course, if you played fantasy last year or followed football, you know the exact opposite happened. He had almost 400 touches. He finished as a running back 3. He was an absolute monster. Now, Jacobs might be an extreme case, and we might not see a guy like Josh Jacobs again for many years. But how about a guy like Ramondre Stevenson? Going into drafts last year, Ramondre Stevenson was being drafted as the running back 32, and this also made a lot of sense. He had a good established running back ahead of him in Damian Harris, and he was on the Patriots, a backfield that's always very tough to trust. But we did hear rumblings in the offseason that Ramondre Stevenson could catch more passes going into 2022, which sounded weird at the time because he's not really a pass-catching back, but those rumblings proved out to be true. He had almost 70 catches, finished as a top 10 PPR running back, not quite to the degree of Josh Jacobs, but another guy who, if you drafted him late in your drafts, he really helped you win fantasy championships last year. Now, why am I bringing up Josh Jacobs and Ramondre Stevenson when I'm talking about somebody who's down far in the ADP list for 2023 when those guys are much higher on the ADP list this year? It's because I think both of them, and especially Ramondre Stevenson, have a lot of parallels to the guy I'm going to talk about. And I could see him having a similar path to Ramondre Stevenson in 2023. And in case you haven't figured it out yet, that would be Antonio Gibson. It's easy to forget, but just a couple years ago, most of the fantasy community loved Antonio Gibson. He was going to be the next Christian McCaffrey. He was going to be the next league-winning running back. Unfortunately, it didn't really happen for him. I mean, he wasn't awful. Year one, he was decent as a rookie on his limited touches, and year two, he had a pretty nice season, rushing for over 1,000 yards. But then last year, they drafted Brian Robinson. We heard rumblings he might be on the special teams player only. And he really had a rough third year. And now people have completely given up on him and really forgotten him. Because he's currently being drafted as the running back 38. That's even lower than Ramondre Stevenson was last year. So you have the parallel to Josh Jacobs with the expectations that haven't been met yet, entering his fourth year, and people have just kind of forgotten him and given up on him. But you have a lot of parallels to Ramondre Stevenson. I mean, let's take a look. Number one, you got the running back ahead of him that everybody thinks is the established running back in Brian Robinson. And yeah, Brian Robinson probably is the lead back. But there's a big problem with Brian Robinson. Namely, he hasn't been very good in college or in the pros. Going back to college, He had a 50th percentile dominator rating, which means he was completely average. He averaged 5 yards per carry, which in the NFL, you'd be like, that's great. In college, it's horrible. That was the 28th percentile, very bad. And it didn't get much better when he got to the pros. He averages 3.9 yards per carry last year, only 4 yards per touch, which was 53rd among running backs. And he was 60th among all running backs in production premium, which basically looks at situations versus the league average and sees how you stack up. Minus 17.2, 60th, well below average. Now I know you could say, hey, the guy was coming back from a gunshot wound to his leg. And I totally get that argument. The fact that he even played last year was incredible. But it's not like we can go back to college and say, hey, this was an elite prospect. He just had to get over that leg injury. He wasn't an elite prospect in college, and he didn't really show much year one in the NFL. So kind of like Ramondre and Damian Harris last year. If Brian Robinson isn't starting off very well, if he gets banged up, we could see Antonio Gibson take over more of the work because Antonio Gibson has handled it in the past. In year two, he handled 258 carries. Now, his yards per carry wasn't very good, but at least we know he can do it. And that's really all we're looking for here. If he could get to that 250 carry mark, then the potential for him to destroy his ADP and be a top 10 running back is absolutely there. But the other big parallel to Ramondre Stevenson that I love for Antonio Gibson this year is the pass catching. So I talked about it, right? Last year, Ramondre Stevenson was starting to get some buzz that he could be the pass catching back. But why did the Patriots even need a pass catching back? Do you remember? It's because James White retired and they didn't have a pass catching back. And Ramondre became that guy and had almost 70 catches last year. Well, what's happened in Washington this year? J.D. McKissic didn't retire, but he's not on the NFL team right now and he's not on Washington. He was their pass catching back. And when you look at Antonio Gibson, he's had over 40 receptions each of the last 2 years, even with J.D. McKissic there. And remember, when he came out of college, he was not a running back in college. He was a wide receiver. The reason people fell in love with this guy coming out of college was because he converted to running back for the NFL draft, and he went out there at 228 pounds and ran a 4.39 40. That was ridiculous. Blew the doors off the combine. So you got a guy who we know can catch. He's a wide receiver turned running back. That's not the issue. Even if Brian Robinson hangs on to the lead role and stays healthy all year, there is a path for Antonio Gibson having 70 or more catches this year. Because in each of the last 2 years, J.D. McKissic has averaged over 3 receptions per game, even with Gibson getting 40 plus catches. Those are gone now. They got to go somewhere, and they're not really going to go to Brian Robinson, who's not a pass catching back. In PPR formats, if Antonio Gibson gets to that 70 catch mark, he's going to be at worst a top 12 PPR running back. And if he can take on more of the lead down work, or if Brian Robinson gets hurt and he has to take over all the lead down work, he could easily crack that top 10 and be this year's Ramondre Stevenson. And look, like Josh Jacobs last year, people have completely forgotten about this guy. His ADP is ridiculously low for the potential upside. Don't be somebody who passes on Antonio Gibson in your drafts. The reward far outweighs the risk. This forgotten hidden gem could be remembered this time next year. So that's a forgotten hidden gem that I discovered, but you want to see some more hidden gems I like? Check out this video right here.